Welcome back, history lovers. Tonight, we are going to walk somewhere the daylight has never quite reached. Not a crypt exactly, not a vault exactly. Something in between. A stretch of corridor beneath Vatican City where the stone stays cold in August, where the lamps are spaced a little too far apart, and where the men who work there have learned to say the word darkness without any drama at all, because to them it simply means the part of the building that is not lit yet. That is the first thing you should know before we begin. The Vatican's darkest mysteries are not dark in the way films have taught us to expect. There is no red bulb spinning above a sealed door. There is no cardinal with a candle and a dagger. The darkness here is quieter and stranger and far harder to shake off. It is the darkness of a room that has been closed for 400 years because nobody could decide what to do with what is inside it. It is the darkness of an answer that was written down, sealed, and then deliberately never opened. It is the darkness of a question the Church asked itself once, in private, and then chose to stop asking out loud. So settle in. Let the pillow take the weight of your head. There are no advertisements tonight, no interruptions, no sudden noises, nothing waiting to jolt you back. If you enjoy these long, slow journeys into the places history keeps under lock, take a moment now to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want more of them. And while you are getting comfortable, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight and what the hour is in your part of the world. I love watching the map of this little audience fill in. Someone in a parked car in Ohio, someone in a flat in Manchester with the rain going, someone in Sao Paulo with the window open, someone in Manila who has already given up on sleeping and decided to enjoy the failure. We will keep each other company for a while. Now, dim the lights, let the fan hum if you have one, and let me take you down. There is a stairwell in the Vatican that does not lead where you think it leads. It begins behind an ordinary panelled door on an ordinary corridor, the sort of door that in any other building would open onto a cupboard full of folded tablecloths. The handle is brass gone brown. The hinges are honest. When you open it, no cold wind rushes out, no organ cord swells. There is only a smell, dry, mineral, faintly sweet, like the inside of an old violin case, and then 22 steps going down, worn into shallow bowls in the middle where 5 centuries of shoes have all chosen the same path. I came to know those steps the way you know a phrase of music. I was not a scholar. I was not a priest. I carried a ring of keys and a small canvas bag of lamp oil and wicks and cloths, and my job, in the plainest words, was light. I went down at dusk and made sure the passages the readers would use in the morning were ready. I trimmed wicks in the older wings where the electricity had never been permitted to intrude. I replaced bulbs in the newer ones. I logged every lamp I touched in a narrow ledger with a pencil tied to it by string, because in a place where the paper is worth more than the building, nobody wants an unrecorded flame. You learn things in a job like that. You learn which corridors carry sound and which swallow it. You learn that the archive has weather, that certain rooms are damp in March and bone dry by June, and that the conservators speak about humidity the way farmers speak about rain. You learn to walk with your shoulders slightly forward, as though apologizing to the shelves. And you learn, within about a week, that the silence down there is not the absence of noise. It is a substance. It has grain, like wood. Some rooms have a fine, close-grained silence that presses on the ears. Others have a loose, echoing silence that seems to be waiting for you to say something so it can repeat it back and prove you were rude. People hear the words Vatican Secret Archives and imagine a padlocked room of horrors. I want to give you the truth about that phrase now, at the beginning, because it will make everything that follows heavier rather than lighter. The Latin word is secretum, and it does not mean scandalous. It means private. Set apart. Belonging to one person. It was the Pope's own filing cabinet, in the same way a king's secretary kept the king's secret correspondence, meaning simply his personal correspondence, the letters that were not for the court. A few years ago, the name was formally changed to the Apostolic Archive, in part because that one Latin word had spent 4 centuries being mistranslated into something feverish. And yet, here is the thing that kept me awake in my own narrow bed after a night shift. The thing that no correction of the Latin ever quite settled. Even if secretum only ever meant private, an institution that has been keeping private records continuously since the 8th century across roughly 53 miles of shelving is going to accumulate more than paperwork. It is going to accumulate the things it could not resolve. Every family has a drawer like that. A letter you did not answer. A photograph you cannot throw away and cannot frame. A bill from a hospital you would rather not think about. Multiply that drawer by 1,000 years and give it the resources of the oldest continuously functioning institution in the Western world, and you get something that no conspiracy theory has ever been imaginative enough to guess at. Not a vault of monsters, a vault of unfinished business. That is the real darkness, and it is much worse. My first winter down there, I was given the Eastern Service Passage as part of my round. It is not a grand corridor. It was cut, I was told, so that carts could move between 2 wings without going up through the ceremonial rooms, which is the kind of practical reason that produces most of the strange architecture in Rome. The lamps along it are set into the wall at shoulder height, 12 of them, and they are numbered on small enamel plates. 11 of those numbers run in order. The 12th plate reads nothing at all. It is blank, not scratched out, not painted over, blank, as though the number had been ordered and never arrived. I asked about it once. The man I asked had worked there 31 years, and he had the particular calm of somebody who has stopped being surprised by anything except kindness. He looked at the blank plate for a while. Then he said that when he had started, an older man had told him that the lamp had a number once, and that the number belonged to a door, and that when the door stopped being used, the number was retired rather than reassigned, because renumbering would have made the old inventories wrong. And making the old inventories wrong, he said, was considered a greater sin than losing the door. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the whole philosophy of the place in one sentence. They would rather lose a room than corrupt a record. The door itself is still there, if you know where to stand. It is set flush into the wall 4 paces past the blank lamp, and it has been plastered over so many times that it reads now as a slight swelling in the surface, the way a healed bone reads under skin. You can find its edges with your fingertips if the light is low and slanting. In the daytime, with the lamps up, it disappears entirely. I have walked past it 100 times and not seen it. I have also stood in front of it at 3 a.m. with a hand lamp held sideways and watched its outline rise out of the wall like a word coming back to you at last. There is no legend attached to it. That is what unsettles me most. If there were a story, a walled-up heretic, a hidden gospel, a sealed plague ward, I could file it away with the other Roman ghost stories that tourists buy at kiosks. But there is nothing. Nobody claims to know. The inventories that would explain it are older than the numbering system that references them, and the numbering system that references them was replaced twice, and each replacement was scrupulous about not correcting its predecessor. So the truth is preserved perfectly, in 3 separate places, in 3 incompatible languages of bookkeeping, and no one has yet had the specific combination of time, permission, and stubbornness required to lay them side by side. That is not a cover-up. It is worse than a cover-up. A cover-up implies someone decided. This is what happens when nobody decides for 400 years in a building that never throws anything away. I began, that winter, to notice how much of the archive is made of that exact material, not concealment. Deferral. There is a difference, and the difference is the subject of everything I am going to tell you tonight. Concealment says, this must not be known. Deferral says, this must not be known yet. The first is a lock. The second is a promise. And a promise is a far more disturbing thing to find in a corridor at 3 a.m. because a promise implies someone on the other end of it. Somebody wrote yet. Somebody in a specific year, with a specific pen, in a specific mood, decided that the world was not ready, and then died, and the note remained, and nobody since has felt authorized to overrule a man who has been dead for 3 centuries about the readiness of a world he never saw. I found my first one in February. A folder being carried past me on a trolley, tipped slightly, and a slip of paper slid from between 2 others and landed on the stone by my boot. I picked it up without reading it, because that is the rule, and the rule is not negotiable. But you cannot unsee a thing you have already seen, and what I had already seen was 4 words in a small brown hand across the top edge, and a date beneath them from the 17th century. The words were, "Not yet, God willing." I handed the slip up to the archivist pushing the trolley. He glanced at it, said thank you, and slid it back where it belonged, and the trolley went on down the corridor with its small companionable rattle, and that was the entire event. Nothing happened. Nothing was revealed. A man 300 years dead had asked God's permission to wait, and had been waiting ever since, and would go on waiting after I had gone up the stairs and out into the ordinary morning where the tourists were already queuing with their cameras raised at the dome. I stood in the passage for a long time after that. The lamps ticked as they cooled. The blank enamel plate held its blank number 4 paces away, and I thought, for the first time clearly, the darkest thing in this building is not a sin. It is patience. It is the willingness of an institution to outlive every person capable of being embarrassed by the truth, and to simply hold the truth, gently, in the dark, until embarrassment is no longer possible. Whether that is mercy or cowardice, I have never been able to decide. Perhaps tonight, somewhere between here and the last section, you will decide for me. Because there are rooms down there far stranger than a plastered door. There is a cabinet of things that were never allowed to be miracles. There is a shelf of apologies that were written, signed, and never sent. There is a chest of counsels that were called and then quietly uncalled. There is a set of ledgers whose entire purpose is to record the moments when the church decided to say nothing at all, and to record them so carefully that the silence itself has a date, a time, and a signature. We will go to all of them. Slowly, there is no hurry down here. The archive has never once been in a hurry, and I would not want to be the first thing in it that was. But before we go further, let me take you to the smallest and strangest of the rooms I have ever been asked to light. It is the room where they keep the things that were burned, or rather the things that were meant to be burned, and were not. The room has no name that appears on any plan. The conservators call it the ash room, which is a joke. And like most jokes told in cold buildings, it is not really a joke at all. It is small, perhaps 4 paces by 6, and it sits behind a heavier door than its contents seem to warrant, on a stretch of corridor where the floor slopes very slightly, so that anything dropped will roll toward the north wall and wait for you there. I was sent down to replace a fixture in it during my second spring, and I remember the archivist who unlocked it for me, pausing on the threshold, one hand flat on the door, the way a man pauses at the edge of cold water. Inside there are no shelves in the ordinary sense. There are drawers, shallow, wide, lined with felt the colour of moss, and every drawer holds objects rather than documents. That alone makes the room an anomaly, because the archive is a kingdom of paper and treats 3-dimensional things as an embarrassment, something to be handed over to the museums where such vanities belong. But these could not be handed anywhere, because they are not art and they are not relics. They are the residue of decisions that were made and then unmade. In the first drawer there are seals. Not documents bearing seals, the seals themselves, lead discs and wax medallions, some still trailing a few inches of cord. Every one of them has been cut from its parchment. That is what stopped my breath. When a document is destroyed, the seal goes with it. The seal is the authority, and the parchment is only the sentence. To cut a seal free and keep it means that someone destroyed the words and could not bring themselves to destroy the permission. There are, by the catalogue's count, more than 60 of them in that one drawer. 60 acts of authority, floating, unattached to any act. I asked what the papers had said. The archivist told me, with no drama at all, that in most cases nobody living knows. The cutting was itself the record. In a few instances there is a marginal note in a register elsewhere in the building, and the notes are always variations on the same 4 or 5 phrases. Withdrawn before promulgation. Recalled at the pleasure of His Holiness, not to be executed, the seal retained. That last one has a coldness to it that I have never been able to warm up. Not to be executed. The seal retained. The order dies, the signature lives. In the second drawer there are wax tablets, and in the third, fragments of burnt paper, genuinely burnt, edges black and crumbling, stored flat between sheets of tissue like pressed flowers. Someone pulled these out of a fire. Not metaphorically. Physically, with hands, at speed, in a hurry, and then someone else, perhaps the same person, perhaps a successor 40 years later, decided that having been half saved, they could not now be finished off. So they lie there in their tissue, 5 or 6 words legible per fragment, and those words are almost never interesting. And therefore, we, the sum of 400, my dear brother in. The drama was in the burning, the survivors are mostly grocery lists and courtesies. But you cannot look at them without understanding that at some hour, in some room in Rome, a fire was lit for a purpose, and then somebody at that fire changed their mind. That is a human moment preserved more exactly than any portrait. The fourth drawer is the one I still see when I close my eyes. It contains keys. Dozens of them, laid in rows, each with a small paper tag tied at the bow. They are of every period, great iron things with wards like cathedral windows, small brass ones worn silky, a few modern ones stamped with numbers. And the tags do not say what the keys open. The tags say when the keys stopped being used, and by whose order. That is all. The archive, faced with a key whose lock had been lost or sealed or forgotten, could not throw the key away, because a key is a record of a door, and a door is a fact, and facts are not disposable. So the keys are kept, and each one is a small metal question, and there are more questions in that drawer than any of us will ever have answers for. I have thought about that drawer more than almost anything else I saw down there. It is the perfect emblem of the whole place. Not a hidden truth. A hidden absence. Somewhere in the building, perhaps behind my blank-numbered plaster swelling, perhaps behind a wall in a wing that has since become an office, perhaps in a building sold 2 centuries ago and now full of accountants, there are locks that these keys would still turn. The metal remembers, the mortar has forgotten, and the institution, unwilling to choose between them, keeps the memory in a felt-lined drawer at 58 degrees and waits. Now, I want to tell you about the thing in that room that made me put down my tools. Against the north wall, where the sloping floor sends everything, there is a wooden box about the length of a forearm. It is not fine. It is joined at the corners with plain dovetails, and it has a sliding lid, the kind a carpenter makes in an afternoon for a purpose he has been told not to ask about. On the lid, burned in with a hot point rather than written in ink, are 2 words in Latin, and beneath them a date in the 1560s. The words mean the remainder. I did not open it. I want to be clear about that, because I know how these stories go, and I know what you would want me to have done, and I want you to trust me for the next 8 sections. I did not open it. I have never opened anything in that building, but the archivist who was with me saw me looking, and after a while he told me what is in it. Because it is not a secret, it is simply not interesting enough to have become famous, which down there is a completely different category of hidden. It contains the sweepings of a room. In the aftermath of a particular process in the 16th century, he did not tell me which, and I did not press. A chamber was cleared, papers were removed, some to be filed, some to be destroyed. and when the clerks were finished, the floor of the room was swept, and the sweepings were not thrown out. They were gathered into a box, labelled the remainder, and shelved. Dust, thread, wax crumbs, the corners torn off documents, pen shavings, a few grains of sand from a sand shaker, and whatever fragments of text were too small to be worth reading and too textual to be worth losing. Somebody, 460 years ago, looked at the dirt on a floor and thought, this was part of it. This should be kept. That is the mind we are dealing with. That is what the word archive means in that building, and it is why the ordinary vocabulary of conspiracy falls apart down there. People want the Vatican to be hiding a document. The truth is that the Vatican is incapable of not keeping the dust. Let me tell you what that does to a person who works among it. By my second year, I had stopped being able to throw things away in my own life. It began small. A bus ticket in a coat pocket that I could not bring myself to bin, because I had been on that bus, and that was a fact, and facts are not disposable. A note from a friend. A shopping list in my mother's handwriting that I found in a book and could not part with, and which I still have, and which says only bread, oil, thread, ask about the roof. 4 words, one of them a question that was presumably asked and answered decades ago, about a roof I have never seen. I kept it. I keep it still. The archive teaches you its disease and calls it reverence, and the terrible thing is that it may be right. Because here is the counter-argument, and it deserves a fair hearing before we go any further into the dark. Every institution that has ever wanted to hide something has had the same tool available to it, and the tool is fire. It is cheap, it is fast, it is complete, and it is entirely deniable. A burned document does not merely become unreadable, it becomes unproven. The accuser is left saying there was a paper, and the accused is left saying was there, and that argument has no flaw, and it can be had forever. The Vatican has had access to fire for 2,000 years. It has had access to it in centuries when nobody was watching, in centuries when no one could have checked, in centuries when a cardinal's word about what did or did not exist was the end of the matter. And what we find when the doors are opened, as they have been opened, wing by wing, pontificate by pontificate, is not ash, it is paper. Enormous, humiliating, inconvenient quantities of paper. Trial records that make the institution look frightened. Ledgers that make it look cold. Private notes that make its greatest men look small and tired and unsure. Letters accusing bishops. Letters accusing popes. Complaints from peasants. Complaints about popes from peasants, filed, indexed, and kept in the Pope's own house. If the goal had been to look good, the fire was always right there. So the darkest mystery of the Vatican archives may not be what is in them. It may be why they exist at all. Why an institution that has staked everything on the claim of being right would build at enormous expense, over more than a millennium, the most comprehensive possible evidence of the times it was wrong. I have heard 3 answers to that. I will give you all 3 tonight, and I will not tell you which one I believe until the very end, when you are half asleep and better equipped to hear it. The first answer is legal. The Church is, and has always been, a machine for adjudicating claims, over land, over marriage, over inheritance, over legitimacy, over the boundaries of dioceses that have not existed since the Ottomans took them. To adjudicate you need precedent, and precedent is only precedent if it is preserved unaltered. The moment you begin trimming the record to flatter yourself, the record ceases to be able to settle anything, and the machine stops working. So the papers are kept for the same reason a court keeps its transcripts, not from virtue, but because the alternative is chaos. The second answer is theological, and colder. It holds that the Church keeps everything because it believes it will be judged on everything, and that the judgment will not be conducted by historians. In this view, the archive is not for us. Destroying a record would be an attempt to deceive a reader who cannot be deceived, and so it would be not only useless, but blasphemous. The paper is kept the way a man keeps his conscience, not because he enjoys it, but because he does not believe he is permitted to put it down. And a third answer, the one I heard only once, late, from a woman who had spent 40 years in conservation and had earned the right to say whatever she liked, was this. She said the church keeps everything because it is old enough to know that it will be wrong again, that it has been wrong before in ways it could not see at the time, wrong with total sincerity, wrong while singing, and that the only defence against a future you cannot imagine is to leave that future the evidence it will need to correct you. Then she went back to her humidity readings, and I went back up the stairs, and the dome was going gold above the square, and I could not stop thinking about a wooden box that held the dust off a floor. But dust is the gentle end of it. In the next room, they keep the miracles nobody was allowed to have. The cabinet is grey. That is the first disappointment, and I want to give it to you honestly, because the room where the Vatican keeps the wonders it could not accept ought by rights to be lined with gold and lit by something trembling, and instead it is grey metal with a dent in the lower left corner where a trolley hit it at some point in the middle of the last century, and nobody has ever thought it worth repairing. It stands against a wall in a working corridor. Files pass it all day. People lean on it while they talk. I have set a lamp on top of it while I worked on the fixture above, and only afterward realised what I had been resting my tools on, and felt a peculiar embarrassment, as though I had put a coffee cup down on a coffin. Inside are the reports of things that happened, and were never permitted to have happened. You have to understand how the Church approaches a miracle before you can understand why this cabinet exists, because the popular picture is almost exactly backwards. People imagine Rome as eager for wonders, hungry for them, ready to canonize any weeping statue that draws a crowd. The truth is the opposite, and it is one of the strangest facts about the institution. The Catholic Church is, in practice, the most sceptical body on earth about miracles. It does not want them. It approves a vanishing fraction of what is brought to it. It employs doctors specifically to explain healings away, and rewards them for succeeding. A claimed cure that reaches Rome is handed first to men whose professional instinct is to find the tumour that was misdiagnosed, the remission that was already underway, the record that was misfiled. Only if those men fail, thoroughly and in writing, does anything move forward, and then it moves at the speed of geology. There are good reasons for this. An institution that has survived 20 centuries has been defrauded a great many times, and it remembers each one. It has seen relics manufactured by the crate. It has seen visionaries who turned out to be ill, or lonely, or paid. It has seen entire villages talk themselves into something over a single hot summer. Caution is not cynicism here, it is scar tissue. But scar tissue makes a body stiff, and what fills that grey cabinet is not fraud. That is the thing. The frauds get disposed of quickly and cheerfully. There is even a certain relish in the paperwork when a case collapses, a sense of a job well done. What is in the cabinet is the other category, the cases that did not collapse, the ones the doctors could not explain, the ones with too many witnesses and too few motives, the ones where the investigating bishop wrote back to Rome in a tone of frank unease, saying in effect, "I went there expecting to end this, and I could not end it, and I do not know what to tell you." And on those files, again and again, in the small dry hand of the courier, you find not a rejection, but a suspension. No canonical framework exists for an apparition of this description. Culturally conditioned, not to be pursued. Unverified, publication would risk scandal. Premonition, not miracle. Archive only. Read those again and hear what they do not say. Not one of them says false. Not one says this did not occur. They say with enormous care that the event does not fit, that it cannot be placed inside an existing category, that saying so publicly would cause trouble, and that therefore the file will be closed and kept. Kept, that is the word that turns the whole thing dark. Because if a bishop's report is nonsense, you dispose of it. Nonsense is cheap. Filing it costs money, costs climate control, costs shelving, costs a catalogue entry, costs a human being's afternoon every 50 years when the collection is surveyed again. The Vatican has spent centuries paying to preserve events that it has officially declined to believe. I want to walk you through one of them, because abstraction protects us and I do not want you protected quite yet. There is a file from rural Spain, early 19th century. The subject is a woman with no education, no property, and no name that history would otherwise have recorded. She reported a figure, and here the file is unusually careful, because she was careful. She did not say the Virgin, she did not say a saint. She had been asked directly and repeatedly, and she said she did not know who it was, only that it was sorrowful, and that it gave no name, and that there was light. That refusal to identify is, in the cold logic of the process, the worst thing she could have done. An unidentified apparition has no theology attached to it. It cannot be slotted anywhere. Had she said the Virgin, they would have had 400 years of procedure to apply. Because she was honest, they had nothing. What followed is documented by neighbours. A child dying, in a house everyone in the village had already entered to say goodbye in. She put her hands on him. He was up within a day. He lived. The local clergy did not sensationalise this. That comes through the parchment like a temperature. Their letters are almost apologetic. They wrote that something had occurred, that they could not account for it, that they were plain men, and that they were asking Rome for guidance because they did not trust themselves. Rome's answer, written in the margin, is 9 words long, no canonical framework for such an apparition. Case closed. And so a village kept its story, and Rome kept its paper, and the two have been sitting apart from each other for 200 years, both of them intact. There is another from Africa, 1927, a drought that had gone past hardship into the arithmetic of who would not survive it. A priest, reluctant, his own letter says he expected to be laughed at, carrying a relic of a saint almost nobody outside the region had heard of, in a procession that was as much desperation as devotion. That night it rained. Not only there, across the region. His report to Rome opens by apologising for sending it. Rome's verdict, culturally influenced, not to be pursued. I sat with that phrase for a long time, in the way you do when a sentence has more inside it than its author intended. Culturally influenced. Meaning these people wanted rain, and they have a tradition of processions, and rain fell, and their reading of that is a product of who they are. Which is true. It is also true of every miracle ever recorded anywhere, including the ones on the approved list. The rain in Andalusia would have been a sign. The rain in that village was culture. I do not say that to make an accusation. I say it because when you read 40 of these files in a row, you begin to see a pattern that has nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with geography. And the pattern is not flattering. And the Vatican has kept the evidence of its own pattern in a grey cabinet with a dent in it, available to anyone eventually. That is the strangest mercy I know of. The institution preserved the proof of its own provincialism. There is a file from the Italian mountains during the cholera years. A convent. Sisters who reported a vision, and again, the detail is what undoes you, a vision that did not promise healing. It asked them to pray for endurance, not for the sickness to lift, for the strength to keep going while it did not. They prayed as instructed. The cholera took the valley. The convent was spared. The report is signed by every woman in the house, which in that period, for women of that station, was an act of some courage. Unverified, may cause scandal if publicised. Consider what scandal means there. Not that they had lied, that people might believe them. That prayer for endurance rather than rescue might be seen to work, and that this would raise questions in every parish where prayers for rescue had been said over the dead. The danger was not falsehood. The danger was implication. And there is a boy, South America, the 20th century, who dreamt the same dream so many nights that he became a nuisance about it. a church coming down, in an earthquake, with people inside. He told anyone who would listen. Nobody listened, which is the ordinary fate of boys with dreams. The earthquake came. The church came down. He lived. Many did not. His parish priest, who by his own account did not know what else to do with what he had witnessed, wrote it up and sent it to his bishop, who sent it to Rome. Premonition, not miracle. No action taken. That verdict is technically correct, by the way. In Catholic theology, a premonition is not a miracle. The categories are genuinely distinct, and the clerk who wrote it was doing his job properly. But go and stand in that village and try the sentence out loud. Try telling a boy who has watched the roof come down exactly as he saw it come down that his experience has been correctly classified and requires no action. The clerk was right. That is what makes it unbearable. Everyone in this story is doing their job, and the outcome is a locked drawer. Now here is the part I have never resolved, and I am going to hand it to you rather than pretend I have an answer. If those events did not happen, the cabinet is a curiosity, a museum of human error, kept for the same reason a doctor keeps notes on cases that turned out to be nothing. If they did happen, then the church has spent 2 centuries holding the wonders of the poor in a metal box in a corridor, unexamined, uncelebrated, unshared, because they arrived in the wrong language, from the wrong latitude, through the wrong kind of person, at a moment when acknowledging them would have been administratively inconvenient. And here is the third possibility, which is the one that actually frightens me. The church does not know either. That is not evasion on its part, it is the honest position, and the drawer is what honesty looks like when you have real power and no certainty. Rome will not say true, because it cannot prove it, and the cost of being wrong in that direction is a false devotion, a cult. Money changing hands, a shrine built on nothing. And Rome will not say false, because it cannot prove that either, and the cost of being wrong in that direction is unthinkable, to have stood in front of something genuine and told the world it was nothing. So it does the third thing, it keeps. I lit that corridor for 4 years. I must have passed the grey cabinet several thousand times. And gradually it stopped looking to me like a filing cabinet and started looking like a waiting room, the kind with plastic chairs, where people sit for hours holding a number and someone eventually calls the numbers, and no one has called these. There are, by one count I was given, several hundred files in there. Several hundred nights when somebody somewhere believed heaven had leaned close, and wrote it down carefully, in their best hand, and sent it to the only address they had for God's office on earth. Every one of them got a reply. That is the detail that stays with me. Rome answered. 9 words, 12 words, a marginal note. Somebody read the letter from the village and picked up a pen. And what they wrote, over and over, in the polite Latin of men who meant no cruelty at all, was, not now. Which brings us to the shelf where they keep the apologies. Apologies are not filed under apologies. Nothing down there is filed under the word you would use for it, which is one of the first practical lessons anyone learns in that building. The categories were made by men who were not thinking about you. They were thinking about the next clerk, and the next clerk knew the system, and the system has now outlived every person who found it intuitive. So the apologies are scattered. They sit inside bundles of correspondence, tucked between administrative letters, folded into the back of files about entirely different matters. You come across them the way you come across a photograph in a book you borrowed. And what identifies them, once you have seen a few, is not the content, but the physical condition. An apology that was sent looks like any other letter, a copy, a register entry, a note of the date of dispatch. An apology that was never sent looks different. It looks finished. It has been written out fair, in the good hand, on the good paper, with a space left at the bottom for a signature that never came. That empty space is the whole story. Somebody wrote it out properly. Somebody believed while they were writing that it was going to be signed. I want to talk about what an unsent apology actually is, because I think the word makes it sound smaller than it is. We think of apology as a social gesture, a thing you say to smooth a room. Inside an institution like that one, an apology is a legal instrument. It is a change to the record. It says that a previous act of the same authority was in error, and once that is said, in writing, under seal, it can never be unsaid, and everything that stood on the old act begins to sway. That is why they are so rare, and why the drafts are so many. The most famous case is one you already know the shape of, even if you have never read a page of it. In 1600, a man was burned in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome for heresy. He had held, among a great many other things, that the universe was infinite, that the stars were suns, and that there might be other worlds with other beings on them. He had also held a number of positions that had nothing to do with astronomy and everything to do with the nature of Christ, which is the part usually left out of the story because it complicates the martyr. He was not burned for saying the earth goes round the sun. He was burned for refusing, across 7 years of imprisonment and interrogation, to stop saying anything at all. That last detail is the one that haunts the files. 7 years. They did not want to burn him. That is not a defence of them, it is an accusation. They wanted him to recant, and they gave him chance after chance after chance, and each chance was also a threat, and he would not take any of them, and at the end of 7 years the machine had run out of options that did not humiliate it. There is a marginal note associated with that process that circulates among the people who work down there, and I cannot tell you whether it is genuine or whether it is the kind of thing an archive grows the way an old house grows a ghost. I heard it 3 times from 3 people and never saw it, so I give it to you as I received it, with that warning attached. The note is said to read, "If we spare him, the doctrine wavers. If we burn him, history will not forgive us." True or not, it is exactly right, and that is why it survives. They knew. That is the point. Whatever else you want to say about the men in that room, they were not fools and they were not blind, and the idea that they burned him in ignorant zeal is a comfort we invented afterwards so that we could feel unlike them. They did the arithmetic. They understood precisely what they were trading and what it would cost them in 300 years, and they made the trade. Because 300 years away is a very long time, and Tuesday is very close. That, I have come to think, is the actual mechanism of nearly every dark thing in that building. Not evil. Discounting, the future is always cheaper than the present. 23 years later, Galileo was warned, and 10 years after that he was tried, and the papers of that trial are among the most read documents in the collection. And the thing that surprises everyone who goes into them expecting thunder is how much of it is about procedure. The astronomy occupies remarkably little space. What occupies the space is whether a particular instruction had been given in 1616, in what form, whether it had been an order or an admonition, whether he had understood it as binding, whether the document recording it was properly executed. A man's life turns on a filing question. The universe is on trial, and the court is arguing about whether the paperwork was correctly served. 359 years later, in 1992, the Church formally acknowledged that the judges had erred. That number gets quoted as an insult, and I understand why. But sit with it a moment from the other side. 359 years is not the length of time it takes a fact to become clear. Everyone involved knew the fact was clear within a century. It is the length of time it takes an institution to be able to afford saying so. To reach a moment where the sentence "we were wrong" does not bring down anything else standing on top of it. And in the space between the error and the admission, there are drafts. That is what I want you to picture. Not a wall of silence. A long, slow accumulation of attempts, men in every generation who sat down and wrote it out and could not get it signed. I saw one of these once, not about Galileo and not about Bruno. A smaller matter entirely. A decision about a religious community in the 18th century that had been suppressed on evidence that later turned out to have been supplied by its enemies. The draft was 2 pages. It was not grovelling. It was, if anything, too dry, the language of an institution admitting error, is a language of clauses, and it moves like a man walking on ice. But there was one sentence near the end, and the sentence said that the men who had been harmed had been faithful, and that their names should be restored to the register. Nothing at the bottom. Good paper. Good hand. A space, and clipped to it, in different ink, from a different decade, a note that said only, hold. Not no, not destroy. Hold, someone read a 2-page admission that innocent men had been ruined, agreed with it enough not to throw it away, and wrote the word hold, and put it back in the bundle, and went to lunch and died, and the paper stayed. I have thought about that man more than I have thought about the cardinals in the famous trials. The famous ones at least did something. He did the more common thing. He deferred. And deferral, done at scale, across centuries, by decent people with reasonable calendars, produces exactly the same outcome as malice and leaves nobody to blame for it. Here is what I could never work out, and I have turned it over for years. Why keep the draft? If you are going to hold it, if the decision is that this apology will not be made in your lifetime, and you know your successor will inherit 100 urgent things and will not go looking, the rational move is to burn it. A destroyed draft costs nothing. A kept draft is a confession. It says, in the most durable medium available, we knew, and we composed the words, and we chose not to say them. It converts a silence into a documented silence, which is infinitely worse, because a silence can be excused as ignorance, and a documented silence cannot. They kept them anyway. Thousands of them, by every account I have heard. The building is full of the language of regret, written out fair, unsigned. I put the question once plainly to the woman in conservation I mentioned before, the one with 40 years and the right to say anything. I asked her why they did not destroy the drafts. She thought about it while she wrote down a humidity figure, because she never stopped working to talk, and then she said something I've repeated to myself many times since. She said that in her experience, nobody in that building had ever destroyed a document because they disagreed with it. They destroyed documents because of damp, or vermin, or fire, or war, or because a room was needed. But the deliberate destruction of a paper on the grounds that it was inconvenient was, she said, almost unknown, and the reason was not virtue. The reason was that the people who handle papers and the people who make decisions are not the same people, and never have been. The cardinal rights hold. The archivist files. The archivist does not have the authority to destroy, because destruction requires an order, and orders come from men who are busy, and no busy man ever spent his afternoon signing a paper whose only effect was to make a small embarrassment disappear from a basement he would never visit. So the drafts survive on the strength of bureaucratic inertia. Not conscience. Not courage. Paperwork. And yet, there is a version of this that is not cynical, and I think it may be the truer one, though I hold it more loosely. Consider what it means to write an apology you know will not be sent. You gain nothing. There is no audience, no credit, no relief. You are, in the most literal sense, writing to the future, leaving a message that says someone here saw it, and named it, and this is the wording, and it is ready when you are. I have seen those drafts, and I do not think they were all written by men resigned to failure. I think some of them were written the way you leave a light on for someone still travelling. And every so often, a very long way down the line, somebody arrives and finds the light burning. In 1992, the Galileo verdict was formally addressed. In the year 2000, on a day of pardon in St. Peter's, John Paul II asked forgiveness in the name of the Church for a list of things that would have been unimaginable to speak aloud in any previous century. For violence in the service of truth, for the treatment of Jews, for the sins committed against women, against the poor, against peoples encountered in conquest. There are people who found that gesture insufficient, and they have their reasons. But something happened that day which almost nobody noticed at the time, and which I did not understand myself until I had spent years underground. The wording did not come from nowhere. It could not have. An institution that speaks in formulae does not improvise an apology for the Inquisition on a Sunday morning. Somewhere in that building, the drafts had been waiting. Which raises the only question that matters about this shelf, and I am going to leave it with you as the lamps get lower. What is written out fair, in the good hand, on the good paper, right now, finished, unsigned, with a space at the bottom, waiting for a century that can afford it? And what, exactly, is it about us that makes this one still too expensive? The chest is made of pine. I want to start there, because everything else in that section of the archive is oak or walnut or steel, and pine is what you use when the thing you are making is not meant to last and then somehow does. It sits low, on a plinth, and it has iron bands that have been replaced at least twice. You can see the ghosts of older nail holes where a previous set was pulled off. Somebody, at least twice, has cared enough about a cheap pine box to repair it rather than replace it. The label tied to the handle is written in a hand from the 18th century, and it says, in Latin, roughly this: Internal Memoranda, Councils Not Held. I have told you about apologies that were written and not sent. This is the larger version. This is the room that was never filled. To understand why this box makes the back of your neck cold, you have to understand what a council is in that world. It is not a meeting. It is the single most powerful instrument the Catholic Church possesses. A general council is the whole teaching body of the institution gathered in one place with the authority to define doctrine, to say what is true, permanently for everyone forever. There have been 21 of them in 2,000 years. 21. That is roughly one per century, and several of those centuries produced none at all. Nicaea gave the world the creed that is still recited every Sunday in 100 languages. Trent, over 18 years, rebuilt the entire church in response to the Reformation, its seminaries, its liturgy, its discipline. Its self-understanding, and the shape it produced, lasted 400 years. The Second Vatican Council, in the 1960s, turned the altars around, put the Mass into the languages people actually speak, and changed the Church's posture toward Jews, toward other Christians, toward the modern world itself. And we are still, 60 years later, arguing about what it meant. That is the scale of the tool. When a council is called, the world changes shape, and in that pine box are the preparations for councils that were called and then were not. Not cancelled in the modern sense, there is rarely a document that says cancelled. That is not how it works. What happens is subtler and much more recognisable to anyone who has ever worked anywhere. Someone proposes. A commission is formed, papers are drafted, an agenda is circulated. 2 or 3 men become genuinely excited, and their excitement is visible in the ink, in the length of their sentences, in the way their handwriting speeds up. Then a note appears in a margin, then a delay of 1 season, for a good reason, then a delay of 1 year, for a better one. Then the man who proposed it dies, or is sent somewhere far away, or simply gets older and stops mentioning it, and the papers go into a box, and the box goes onto a plinth, and the world carries on in the shape it already had. Nobody killed it. That is what makes it unbearable to read. There is no villain in the pine box. There is only weather. Let me give you the outlines of what is in there, because the specific cases are worse than the general principle. There is a bundle from the early 18th century concerning the relationship between the Church and the new natural philosophy. And here is the surprise. It is not hostile. That is the thing nobody expects. The men drafting it are not trying to build a wall against science. They are trying to build a door. There is a phrase in one of the memoranda about not fearing the movement of the stars, about learning to read the heavens as a language rather than a threat. There are proposals for teaching astronomy in seminaries. There is a suggestion, remarkable for its date, that the Church should distinguish carefully between what Scripture teaches about salvation and what it appears to say about physical mechanics, and should stop staking its authority on the second. That is essentially the position the Church would arrive at officially. in the 20th century. It is sitting in a pine box worked out in the 1700s. At the bottom of the final page, in red, perhaps the time will be right after another century. Another century, written by a man who knew he would not see it, who therefore was not delaying for his own comfort, who was in some sense being modest, and who, by writing those 8 words instead of pressing, cost the world 100 years of a conversation that had already been had in Rome. In private, correctly, there is a second bundle from the 1930s. The tone of this one is completely different. It is not lyrical, it is fast, and it is frightened, and it is typed. It proposes a council to address the rise of the total state. The drafts argue that the Church should declare, at the highest possible level of authority, that no government may command the conscience, that loyalty to a nation cannot outrank loyalty to God, and, this is the sentence that stops you, that the dignity of every human person is a divine fact, independent of race, nation, or blood. Say that in 1937, with the full weight of a general council behind it, in every parish in Germany, in Italy, in Poland, in Spain, in every language, and I do not know what happens next. Nobody knows. It might have changed nothing. Regimes are not usually argued out of existence. But a great many people who were later told that obedience was their duty would have heard, first, from the pulpit they trusted, that it was not. There is a note near the end of that bundle. World situation unstable. Too risky. Silence advised. Too risky. In 1937. As though the alternative were safe. I read about that bundle long before I ever worked underground, and I confess I read it then as cowardice, and I said so, loudly, to anyone who would listen. I am less sure now, and I want to be fair to the dead, so let me put the other case as strongly as I can. The men who wrote Too Risky were not imagining an abstraction. They had specific numbers in front of them, the number of Catholic schools operating in Germany, the number of religious houses, the number of priests still able to work, the number of people the Church was already quietly moving out of danger. They had recent experience of what happened when Rome spoke plainly. In 1937, an encyclical was issued, written in German rather than Latin, so that it could not be ignored, smuggled into the country and read from pulpits on Palm Sunday, and the response was raids, arrests, presses seized, and a marked worsening for exactly the people it had been meant to protect. So when a cardinal wrote silence advised, he was not shrugging. He was making a calculation that a louder voice would buy fewer lives than a quieter presence. It may even have been the correct calculation on the day. History has not settled it, and I am not going to settle it for you at 1 a.m. But here is what the pine box does to that defence, and it does it without argument, simply by existing. It preserves the drafts. If the silence had been an easy or obvious call, there would be no drafts. You do not spend a year composing a declaration you have no intention of making. The papers prove that inside that building, at that moment, there were men who wanted to say it, who wrote it out, who believed it was true, and who were overruled by a judgment about consequences. The Church did not merely keep silent, it kept the record of choosing to. And that pattern repeats through the box in a way that becomes almost rhythmic if you read the summaries in order. A proposal in the late 19th century for a council condemning the racial pseudoscience then spreading through European universities. The drafts quote scripture on all men being made in one image, and include letters from missionaries in Africa and Asia begging Rome to say something about what they were watching colonial administrations do. In the margin, may be interpreted politically. Defer. Proposals on colonial exploitation. On the conscience of the individual under modern democracy. On the treatment of indigenous peoples. Each one begins in hope and ends in a word like suspended, or in nothing at all, a page half covered and then simply blank, which is the worst of them, because a blank page means a man stopped writing mid-thought and did not come back. May be interpreted politically. I have thought about that phrase more than any other in the entire archive, and I have arrived somewhere uncomfortable that I want to share with you. because I suspect it applies well beyond Rome. Everything true is interpretable politically. That is not a bug in truth. It is a property of the world. There is no statement about human dignity that cannot be read as a comment on some government. There is no defence of the poor that does not embarrass someone rich. The moment you adopt this may be interpreted politically as a reason for silence. You have not chosen neutrality. You have handed a veto over everything you might say to whoever happens to be in power, because they decide what is political, simply by taking an interest in it. And it does not feel like cowardice from the inside. It feels like prudence. It feels like statesmanship. It feels, and this is the trap, like responsibility, like you are the only adult in the room who understands the consequences. That is the darkest thing in the pine box, and it is not a secret at all. It is a mechanism, fully documented, repeatable, and available to every institution and every person who has ever had something true to say and a reason to wait. I lit that room perhaps once a month. It is not on a main route. The lamp there is a poor one and the shadows are long, and the box sits low so that you have to look down at it, which I always found strange, because everything else in that building makes you look up. Once, at the end of a shift, I sat on the floor beside it for a while. I was tired, and it was warmer than the corridor, and I let myself imagine the rooms. The council on the stars in the 1720s, bishops from every province arriving in a Rome that smelled of horses, arguing for 3 years about whether the book of Genesis is a physics textbook, and concluding, in a document with 200 signatures on it, that it is not. Everything after that goes differently. Not smoothly, nothing goes smoothly, but differently. And the other one, cardinals in 1937, in a hall with the windows open on a hot September, voting to declare that no state may own a conscience, and the vote being read out that night on the radio the archive refuses to mention, and a man in Munich turning the dial and hearing it. Then I stopped, because the imagining is a kind of cruelty you perform on yourself, and because the room was cold, and because there is a rule about sentiment down there which nobody states but everyone obeys. The papers are not yours to feel things about. You carry them, or you light them, or you keep them dry. What they mean is somebody else's job, and that job is scheduled for a century you will not live in. I got up and put my hand flat on the lid, the way you do on the roof of a car that has just been driven a long way. Pine, warm from nothing at all. 21 councils in 2,000 years, and underneath the floor in a cheap box that somebody has cared enough to repair twice, all the ones that would have made it 25. Which brings us to the ledgers, and I should warn you, before we go there, that the ledgers are worse. The pine box holds things that were never said because the moment passed. The ledgers hold the moments where the church looked directly at something, wrote down exactly what it was looking at, and then formally, deliberately, with a date and a signature, resolved to say nothing. They are the most beautiful objects in the archive. I need you to understand that first, because it makes everything that follows harder to bear, and I would rather you were not comfortable. The ledgers are bound in calf, uniform in height, ranked along their shelf like a row of teeth. The leather has gone the colour of strong tea. The spines carry no titles, only dates, tooled in a blind stamp that catches the lamplight when you move past at an angle, so that the whole shelf seems to blink at you as you walk. The paper inside is heavy laid stock, with a rag content that has kept it supple for 200 years. The ruling is done in a pale grey that does not compete with the ink. The margins are generous. The hand, and it is many hands across many decades, which is the astonishing part, is so consistent that you have to look for the changes. Somebody trained those clerks. Somebody set a standard and enforced it, generation on generation, so that the record would read as one voice. And what that voice says, over and over, in a formula that appears so often it stops looking like language and starts looking like a pattern in the paper, is this: nulla pronunciatio hoc tempor. No pronouncement will be made at this time. Every entry has the same architecture. First, the date and place. Then the matter, set out plainly, sometimes at length, with a summary of the evidence received. Then the deliberation, and this is where the ledgers become extraordinary, because the deliberation is not smoothed over. You can see the disagreement. Certain of the fathers urged condemnation, others cautioned that intervention would be construed as political interference. It was observed that the testimony of the witnesses is credible and consistent. The clerks recorded the arguments against silence with the same care as the arguments for it. Nobody was cooking the books. And then the last line, the formula. No pronouncement will be made at this time. I want to walk slowly here, because this is the heart of everything I have told you tonight, and everything I have left to tell. An entry from 1871. The matter concerns reports of abuse within a religious order in Europe. The testimony had been taken. The evidence had been collected and summarised. The Commission's recommendations for reform are set out in a numbered list, and then the finding that to proceed would risk a greater scandal than to delay, and that the matter should be reviewed quietly in due course. There is no later entry. The review does not appear. Due course never arrived. Read that sentence again, because you already know its shape. To proceed risks greater scandal than to delay. That is not medieval language. That is not the vocabulary of a world we have escaped. That is the sentence that would be written in almost exactly those words, in a great many offices, in a great many countries, for the next 140 years, in dioceses, yes, and also in schools, in hospitals, in broadcasting corporations, in police forces, in charities, in film studios. It is the standard human formula for the moment when an institution discovers that telling the truth will cost it more than the truth is worth to the people it is about. And there it sits, in a beautiful hand, in 1871, in the Pope's own house, filed, indexed, retained. That is the thing I cannot get past. They wrote it down. If you are covering something up, you do not enter the cover-up in the register. The register is the one place you must not put it. And yet there it is, in the good ink, on the good paper, with a date. Because to those clerks it was not a crime being concealed, it was a decision being minuted. And decisions get minuted. The bureaucratic conscience is a strange organ. It will permit almost anything except an incomplete file. There is an entry from the late 19th century on colonial violence. Missionaries writing back from Africa about forced labour, about the brutality inflicted on converts, about extraction dressed up as evangelism. The deliberation records bishops arguing for condemnation and others warning against entanglement with the European powers. Verdict: the matter will not be addressed publicly at this time. There are entries on authoritarian leaders, on indigenous populations, on the Church's relationships with regimes it would rather not name. The justifications vary: unity, prudence, insufficient clarity, the risk of division, and the outcome does not vary at all. And there is one from 1943. It concerns the deportations from Italy. The knowledge is not in question. The entry establishes it plainly. Trains, names, families. The note recording the decision is short and unsigned, and I have carried its 3 sentences around with me for years, the way you carry a stone in a coat pocket and keep finding it. There is knowledge. There is no voice. We pray, but we do not speak. I do not know who wrote that. I do not know whether he wrote it in resignation or in protest, or simply because a summary was required and those were the accurate words. I have decided, without evidence, that he wrote it in horror because we pray but we do not speak is not the phrasing of a comfortable man. A comfortable man writes no action deemed prudent at this juncture. You only write we pray, but we do not speak if you can hear how it sounds. Now let me give the other side its hearing, properly, because I have promised you fairness, and because the easy verdict is the one I distrust most. In Rome, in 1943, The German army was in the city. The Vatican was 110 acres of neutrality inside an occupied capital, with no army beyond a ceremonial guard. And it was at that moment sheltering. In convents, in monasteries, in seminaries, in the papal residence at Castel Gandolfo, thousands of people whose discovery would have meant their deaths and the deaths of those hiding them. The precedent that hung over every deliberation was recent and specific, in the Netherlands the previous year. When the bishops had publicly and courageously protested the deportations, the reprisal had fallen immediately on Catholic converts of Jewish descent who had until then been exempted, and they were seized within days. So the calculation in that room was not between speaking and comfort. It was between speaking and the people currently under the floorboards. That is a real argument. Anyone who tells you it is not is selling you something. And I have gone round it 100 times, and I always arrive at the same place, which is not a verdict but a discomfort, and I will try to put it exactly. The argument is strong for a week. It is strong for a month. It weakens every single day it is used, and it becomes something else entirely once it has been used for years, because a prudential judgment that always, in every circumstance, on every continent, across every decade, arrives at silence, has stopped being a judgment. It has become a policy that only wears the clothes of judgment, and the ledgers prove that it was making the same journey to the same destination in 1871, in 1889, in 1903, in 1927, in 1943. Different facts, different dangers, same last line, in the same beautiful hand. The formula was not discovered under pressure in the war. The formula was already there, worn smooth by use, waiting. That is what an archive does to your certainty. Anyone can defend a single decision. Nobody can defend a pattern, and only an archive can show you a pattern, and this archive was built by the people the pattern indicts. Which brings me to the last thing in that room, and then I will let you rest. Near the end of one volume, I was told this by two people separately, years apart, and their accounts agreed on the detail that matters. There is an entry concerning reports of violence against a vulnerable community. The particulars are recorded in the usual way. The deliberation is recorded in the usual way. And the last line is the formula, exactly as it appears 3,000 times elsewhere. No pronouncement will be made at this time. But beneath it, in a smaller hand, in different ink, squeezed into the space where the next entry should begin, somebody has written 4 words. God forgive our silence. It is not a formula. It is not in the register's language. It breaks every rule of the document it appears in. A clerk does not editorialize. A clerk does not pray in the margin. A clerk does not leave anything on the page that a superior could read and object to. Whoever wrote it took a risk, alone, at a desk, at the end of a working day, and knew that he was defacing an official record, and did it anyway, because he could not let the page close on that calm, bureaucratic sentence without adding something human to it. He did not sign it. Of course he did not. But he wrote it in a book that he knew would be kept forever, in a building that never throws anything away, and I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He was not confessing to his superiors. He was writing to us. And that is the strangest inversion of the whole night, so let me say it plainly before the lamps go down. The ledgers of silence are the loudest documents in the Vatican. They are the only place where the institution's failures are recorded by the institution itself, in its own hand, on its own paper, at its own expense, with dates and deliberations attached, in a form no critic could ever have compiled from the outside. Every historian who has ever indicted the Church for its silences has done so using evidence the Church wrote down about itself, and then preserved for a century and a half so that someone could eventually come and read it. That is either the most self-defeating administrative habit in human history, or it is a very slow, very strange form of confession. The kind made not to a priest behind a screen, but to a future you will never meet, on the understanding that they will judge you, and that they should. I put the volume back on its shelf the one time I saw one open. The leather made that small sound leather makes. The blind stamped date caught the lamp and went dark again as I stepped past, and I climbed the 22 steps thinking about 4 words in a smaller hand, written by a man whose name nobody will ever know, in the margin of a decision he was not permitted to argue with. God forgive our silence. Somebody down there was not at peace. That is the only thing in the whole archive I have ever found genuinely consoling. Now, are you still with me? Good. Let the pillow take a little more of your weight. There are 4 sections left, and the worst of the cold is behind us. Because the next room does not hold decisions at all. It holds people, men and women who were considered for sainthood and never allowed to arrive. And the reasons they were stopped are not the reasons you would guess. The cabinet in this room is modern, and that is the shock of it. After the pine and the calf and the brass gone brown, you turn a corner and there is grey steel with a keypad, humming faintly, the only thing in the whole underground that makes a noise of its own. It was installed within living memory. It exists because some of what is inside it concerns people whose children are still alive. The folders are labelled with a phrase that translates more or less as cause suspended. To understand what that means, you have to understand what a cause is. When someone dies with a reputation for holiness, their local bishop can open an investigation. Testimony is gathered from everyone who knew them, not the flattering kind either. The process specifically hunts for people who disliked them. Every word they ever wrote is collected and read by theologians looking for error. Their finances are examined, their temper is examined, their treatment of subordinates is examined. If they survive that, they are declared venerable. Then a miracle must be proven, medically, by doctors paid to disprove it, and they become blessed. Then another, and they are canonized. The whole thing can take 400 years. It is designed to be survivable only by the genuinely extraordinary, and the design mostly works. But there is a category the design was not built for, and that category fills the steel cabinet. These are not people who failed the tests. These are people who passed them, whose virtue was documented, whose miracles were investigated, whose enemies could produce nothing, and who were stopped anyway, at a later stage, for a reason that appears in the file under a heading with no theological existence at all. The reason is almost always the same. They said something. There is a file concerning a bishop from the Second World War. The testimony section is thick, because he had spent the occupation hiding people, in monasteries, in the roofs of churches, in a seminary where the students were told to say nothing and said nothing. Survivors gave evidence decades later. Their statements are the sort of thing the process exists to find. He came when no one else came. He asked us nothing. He fed my mother. That should be the end of it. That is precisely, exactly what sanctity looks like when it is not decorative. And then, in the same file, his own writings. Letters composed after the war, when the danger had passed and he had time to think about what he had watched. They ask whether the caution of the wider church during those years had been prudence or complicity. They are not intemperate. They are the questions of a man who had personally carried the weight and wanted an accounting. The note in the margin, heroic in action, but his writings risk division. Cause suspended. He is not accused of pride, or of error, or of any of the things the process is actually built to detect. He is accused of raising a subject, and so a man who risked being shot for strangers will not be held up as an example, because the example comes attached to a question, and the question is still live. There is a woman from the 1920s, a mystic. Her writings are luminous, the assessors say so. You can feel the reluctance in their prose as they admit it. But her visions did not stay inside the walls. She described kneeling beside a Muslim and a Jew and hearing the same God answered to in different names. Her local reputation was enormous. Her humility is attested by everyone who met her. The note, beloved locally. Theologically premature. Premature, sit with that. Not wrong. Early because 40 years after her death the Second Vatican Council, would declare that the Church regards with esteem the Muslims who adore the one God, and would repudiate the teaching that the Jewish people are collectively guilty of anything, and would say that whatever is true and holy in other traditions is not to be rejected. The Church would arrive, formally, at something remarkably close to where she had already been standing. She was not stopped for being wrong. She was stopped for arriving before the traffic. And nobody, so far as anyone can tell me, went back afterward and reopened her file. That is the part that undoes me. The clock ran out on the objection, and the objection is still on the paper. Because in that building, nothing moves unless somebody with authority pushes it, and the people with authority have 12,000 more urgent things. And she has been waiting 100 years for an administrative gesture that would take an afternoon. There is a laywoman from Latin America, from a period of civil conflict. She ran networks that got children out before the soldiers could take them. She fed people. She stood in front of armed men with nothing but her voice more than once, and it is documented, and she survived it more than once, which is its own kind of improbable. Bishops supported her cause. Her private writings burn. Not only against the government, that would have been survivable, but against churchmen who she believed had chosen their own safety over the children she was hiding. If the house of God cannot protect the innocent, she wrote, then the stones will rise in judgment against it. The assessment is 4 words: sanctity eclipsed by tone. Tone, I have turned that phrase over for years and I have never been able to make it sit still. Because whatever else the Christian tradition is, it is not a tradition of moderate tone. Its founder turned over tables in the temple and called the religious authorities of his day whitewashed tombs. Its prophets were, to a man, unbearable. Jeremiah was thrown in a cistern. Its greatest reformers were not diplomats. Catherine of Siena wrote to the Pope and told him plainly to stop being a coward and come home to Rome, and she is a doctor of the Church. Sanctity has been eclipsing tone since the beginning. That is roughly what sanctity is. So the objection cannot be theological. It has to be something else, and I think the something else is simple and human, and almost sympathetic when you say it out loud. Canonization is not only a statement about the dead, it is a recommendation to the living. When Rome raises someone up, it is saying, be like this. And every institution that has ever existed has had to decide which of its heroes it can safely recommend. Because some of them, if you actually imitated them, would come for the institution itself. Hold up the bishop who asked whether the Church had been complicit, and you have told 10,000 priests that asking is holy. Hold up the woman who said the stones would judge the house of God, and you have blessed her sentence along with her. Hold up the mystic who heard God in a mosque in 1924, and you have moved a boundary you are not yet ready to move. That is not corruption. That is an institution understanding perfectly well what it is doing. And it is very much darker than corruption, because corruption can be rooted out, and this cannot. This is the ordinary logic of any body that must both tell the truth and continue to exist. There is one more file I want to give you, the smallest, and then I will let you sink. A nurse. An epidemic. The file does not need to specify which. There have been so many. She worked without rest. She buried people whose families would not come. She held hands that nobody else would hold, and she caught what she was treating. And she died of it, and the people of that town called her a saint before she was cold, which is the only kind of acclamation that has never in 2,000 years been faked. Her cause did not advance. The reason is on the paper. During the epidemic, she had said publicly that the Church had been too slow, that resources had sat idle, that men in good houses had waited for instructions while people died in the street. She was not wrong. Nobody in the file claims she was wrong. The assessment says her words were inopportune. She is in a steel cabinet with a keypad on it in a corridor under Rome because she was right at an inconvenient volume. Now, here is what I want to leave you with before the lamps go lower, and I want to be careful. Because it would be easy to end this section in bitterness, and bitterness is not what these files actually contain. None of these people were condemned. That matters more than it sounds. The Church has a mechanism for condemning. It has used it enthusiastically across its history. It did not use it here. It did not declare them false, or proud, or deluded. It gathered every scrap of evidence of their goodness, indexed it, and put it somewhere with climate control and a lock, and it has paid for that room every year since. Which means that somewhere in the machinery, someone decided that these people were not to be forgotten, only not yet spoken of. The file is not a grave. It is a held breath. And the held breath sometimes does release. Scar Romero was shot at the altar in 1980, and his cause sat blocked for decades over precisely this objection, that his sanctity was political, that his tone was divisive, that recognizing him would be read as taking a side. He was canonized in 2018. Titus Brandsma, a Dutch friar who told Catholic newspapers not to print Nazi propaganda and died in Dachau for it, waited 80 years. Charles de Foucauld waited a century. So the cabinet is not a sentence of oblivion. It is a queue, a brutally slow one, administered by an institution that measures time in centuries and will not be hurried by anyone's grief. But I have stood in front of it with a lamp, and I will tell you the thought that came and would not leave. Every person in that cabinet is there for the same reason. Not one of them is there for a hidden sin. Not one of them was found to have been cruel, or false, or secretly monstrous, because the process is genuinely good at finding that, and when it finds it, the file goes in the bin and nobody builds a steel cabinet for it. They are all there for having been correct too early, or too loudly, or in front of the wrong people. Which means that the room does not contain the Church's failures. It contains the Church's conscience, separated out, catalogued, and stored at a stable temperature, because a conscience is unbearable to keep in the room where you are working. I lit that corridor perhaps 200 times. The cabinet hums. It is the only thing down there that hums. Everything else in that building is silent, and the one object that makes a sound is the one holding the people who would not shut up. I am aware that is a coincidence of electrical engineering. I have never been able to hear it that way. There are 3 sections left. The cold parts are behind us now. Mostly what remains are the small voices, children, villagers, popes writing at 2 a.m. to nobody. And I promise you they are gentler, though not by very much. Now we come to the small voices, and I will keep my own voice low for these, because they have already been shouted over quite enough. Start with the children. There is a run of folders, thin as a hand's width, filed under a heading that means the boys of the Apostolic Palace. For a great many centuries the papal household ran on children. Not as a scandal, as a system. Noble families across Italy and beyond sent their sons at 7 or 8, and it was an honour, and it was also a placement. The way a family today might angle for an internship. The boys served as pages and altar attendants and message carriers. They learnt Latin, deportment, how to hold a candle for 40 minutes without letting the flame shake, how to walk on marble without sound. They also, some of them, wrote home. That is why the folders exist. Letters were carried by household servants, and some never left the building, and some were copied, and some were confiscated, and the archive being what it is, none were thrown away. So there survives, in the Pope's own house, a small collection of homesickness. One boy, call him by the name that appears, Matteo, 17th century, begins with wonder. His first letter is almost unreadable for excitement. The ceilings. The incense. He has been given livery. He has seen the Holy Father pass at a distance of 9 paces, and he counted them. He tells his parents to tell everyone. By winter the tone has changed. He writes that the corridors are full of people and no sound. He misses his sister's laugh, which he specifies in a way children do, as being too loud and getting her in trouble. And then a line I have never been able to shake, which I will give you as close to the original as I can carry it. Even when many walk here, it is quiet, as though the walls swallow every word. He was, I think, about 9. There is a disciplinary note in another folder about a boy who was reprimanded. Not for theft, not for insolence, not for any of the ordinary crimes of 9-year-olds. He had refused to leave the bedside of a sick servant, a grown man, feverish of no rank, and had stayed holding his hand past the hour when he was required elsewhere. The margin note reads, "Too much softness. The boy must learn severity if he is to serve." I have read a great deal of cruelty in that building, most of it written by men who believed they were being responsible, and that sentence is the one that still makes my jaw tighten. Because whoever wrote it was not a monster. He was a tutor with a formation program and a theory of character. And his theory was that tenderness was a weakness that would fail the boy later, and he was making a note in a file the way a schoolmaster does on a Thursday. And the boy learned, that is the part nobody records. The file does not say what he became. It never does. The archive follows these children with enormous care right up until the day their service ends, and then drops them completely, because their function has concluded, and the record is a record of function. But there are also, and I want you to have these too, the small refusals. A pair of pages caught whispering poetry after hours, Virgil smuggled and punished mildly, and the tutor's note says, apparently without irony, they seek beauty where they are told to seek silence. Birds doodled in the margins of a Latin exercise, wings done clumsily, over and over, the way a bored child does a thing until it is right. Paper boats, folded, found wedged in the crack under a chapel bench, presumably by somebody cleaning. And kept. Because they were found in a place of record, and a thing found in a place of record is evidence of something even when nobody knows of what. There are, in the Vatican Apostolic Archive, in a controlled environment, at some expense, a small number of paper boats made by children who have been dead for 200 years. And one letter, unsigned, in a hand that is still learning to hold the line, which says, "They say we are chosen to serve, but I think we are chosen to be silent." I pray God hears children, for here no one else does. I am going to leave that where it is. It does not want commentary. Now the villagers. There is a drawer labelled with a phrase meaning the chronicles of the villages, and it is the least impressive object in the entire underground. The papers inside are cheap. Some are scraps. The ink is bad, iron gall gone brown and eating through in places, because a country parish bought what it could afford. The handwriting is often poor, and the Latin is often worse. You can watch a priest reach the edge of his education mid-sentence and switch into his own dialect, because the thing he needs to say does not exist in the language he was taught. These are the letters that came up to Rome from the bottom. A French priest, 14th century, opens without ceremony. The people are starving, and they ask where God has gone. He describes the blight. He describes the processions he has led through dead fields with a relic held above his head, the bells rung to push back despair. And then, flatly, the faithful kneel, and the earth gives no bread. There is no record of a reply. There often is not. You have to hold two things at once here, that Rome received thousands of these and could not have answered them all, and also that this specific man, in this specific parish, waited. An English chronicle from a plague village records the deaths with a bookkeeper's precision, and then breaks. The people fear not only death, but each other. A mother refuses to nurse her child. A brother refuses to bury his sister. Charity has grown thin as the grave fills thick. That is not theology. That is a man watching the social contract dissolve in his own square and reaching for the only instrument he has, which is a pen. And then, scattered through, the doubt. Written down. Sent to Rome. Kept. I do not know if heaven listens. I pray because I must, but I pray with trembling hands. And the one that I think is the finest sentence in the entire archive better than anything in the papal bulls, better than anything composed by a cardinal with a secretary and a career. If I tell them God is silent, they despair. If I tell them God is near, I lie. So I tell them both, and I kneel beside them in the cold. A parish priest wrote that. Nobody knows his name. He had no training in the problem of evil beyond what he had seen, and he solved it, or rather he refused to solve it, and stayed, which in the circumstances was the only honest theology available. But the villages are not only grief, and I would be misleading you if I left them there. A German parish in a hard winter, gathering not in the church but in a barn, because the barn had animals in it, and animals make heat, and singing hymns by candlelight, and the priest noting that the voices got stronger with each verse. An Italian village after years of famine, processing through the fields with loaves held up like relics. A father in Spain carving a small cross for a daughter dead of fever, and telling the priest, if heaven takes her, let heaven also see she had a father who loved her. Villagers in Poland planting flowers on graves, the chronicler writes that it was not decoration, that they did it deliberately, that the sense of it was, if death surrounds us, let beauty be louder. None of this was useful to Rome. None of it settled a doctrinal question or resolved a dispute over a benefice. It was filed anyway. And now the third small voice, which is the one nobody expects to find in this category at all. The popes. There is a drawer of private papers, not the official correspondence which fills wings, but the other kind. Notes, drafts, journals, letters begun and abandoned, things written by men at hours when nobody was watching them be infallible. A pope in the 17th century, in a letter to a friend whose name is missing, writing about the wars of religion tearing Europe. If I speak too boldly, I divide the faithful. If I remain silent, I betray them. The letter stops mid-page. He did not finish it. He did not send it. Pius IX, after the loss of the Papal States, on scraps, a king without a kingdom. I am shepherd to millions, and yet I wander as though exiled from my own pasture. Benedict XV during the First World War, on a single sheet, in Latin, the world is tearing itself apart, and I, who should heal, cannot mend a single wound. And one line, which I am told appears in a private note, and which I have never seen, and which I repeat only because I heard it 3 times, and each time from someone who had no reason to invent it, I kneel. But some nights I do not feel heaven listening. Perhaps that is faith, to pray even when the sky is silent. Now look at what we have. A 9-year-old page writing that the walls swallow words. A starving French curate asking where God went. A pope on a scrap of paper wondering whether anyone is on the other end. 3 men, one of them a child, separated by centuries and by every conceivable gradation of rank, all writing the same sentence in different vocabularies. I am speaking, and I do not know if I am heard, and the archive has them within a few hundred meters of one another, at the same temperature, on the same schedule of inspection, in the same building. That is the thing I came to underground, in the end, and it is why I have kept talking to you all this time. The Vatican archive is famous for what it might be hiding, but its actual scandal, the one nobody sells books about, is that it is the only institution in the world that has kept the doubts of the powerful and the doubts of the powerless in the same house, indexed by the same system, preserved to the same standard. A pope's despair and a page boy's homesickness receive identical care. There is no hierarchy in the humidity. That is either an accident of bureaucratic uniformity, or it is the single most radical thing the Catholic Church has ever done, and I genuinely do not know which. 2 sections left. Stay with me a little longer, or don't if you have gone under. That is a compliment and not a failure, and the recording will be here tomorrow. Because there is one more absence I have to show you, and it is the strangest of all of them. It is not a room, it is a hole in the record, roughly the shape of the last 150 years. Everything I have shown you so far has been a thing. A drawer, a box, a cabinet, a shelf. Now I have to show you a hole, which is harder because you cannot light a hole and you cannot put your hand on one. It took me 2 years to notice it, and I only noticed because of the lamps. Part of my job was maintenance history, knowing which fixtures were old, which had been converted, which had never been touched. And the maintenance ledgers for the buildings are magnificent. They go back centuries. They record wax by the pound, wicks by the gross, oil by the barrel, the names of the men who trimmed and cleaned. The cost of replacing a lamp glass broken in 1704 by a servant whose name is given along with the deduction from his wages. And then, at a certain point in the 19th century, they thin out. Not stop. Thin. The entries get shorter. The detail drops away. Electricity arrives in Rome and arrives in those buildings, and in the ledgers there is almost nothing. A great transformation in the physical experience of worship. The fact that a Mass could now be said at midnight in full brightness, that a fresco unseen properly in 300 years could suddenly be looked at, that the flicker which had shaped every religious interior since the catacombs simply ended, and the record has nearly nothing to say about it. Once you have seen that shape, you see it everywhere. The railway. Europe in the 19th century is being rebuilt around iron. Pilgrimage is being transformed. A peasant who could never have reached Rome can now reach it in 3 days, and the archive's own accounts of the period speak in the language of pastoral challenge and worldly distraction. The word machine is scarce. The word industrial is scarce. The cinema. An entirely new grammar of human imagination arrives, and governments across the world panic about it within a decade, and what survives in the record is careful and vague. Moving pictures may influence the young. Bishops must remind the faithful of modesty. No analysis. No engagement with what film actually was. A form that would define the century, addressed as a hygiene problem. Radio, and this one is genuinely eerie. Vatican Radio was founded in 1931. Marconi himself built it. The Pope's voice went out over the whole earth for the first time in history, and the technology became, within a decade, the principal instrument by which the papacy addressed the world through a war. And when you go looking in the ordinary run of files for the arguments, the anxieties, the internal debates about what it meant to have a voice that could enter every kitchen in Europe, the medium is largely absent. The messages survive. The wrestling with the medium does not. By the time you reach the digital age, the omission is close to total. The categories simply end at the edge of the analogue world, the way a road ends at a coastline. Now, I want to be very careful here because this is the point where a story like this can tip into nonsense, and I would rather lose your interest than your trust. There are perfectly ordinary reasons for a hole of this shape. The first is the rule. The Vatican archive opens by pontificate, and it opens slowly, and the material must be catalogued before it can be released, a process that takes decades of specialist labour. The reign of Pius XII, which covers the war, was only open to researchers in 2020, and the work of reading it will occupy scholars for the rest of my life. So a great deal of what I am calling absence is simply the wrong side of a moving line. The second is that modern institutions generate their records elsewhere. The 19th century church did not stop thinking about railways. It thought about them in newspapers, in encyclicals, in seminary journals, in the correspondence of national bishops' conferences, in bodies that keep their own archives in their own countries. The centre stopped being the only place where the institution's mind was written down. And the third, the least romantic and probably the largest, nobody files the present properly. Your own life is undocumented in exactly this way. You have your grandmother's letters and none of your own emails. You have the photograph of your great-uncle in uniform and 11,000 photographs on a phone that nobody will ever look at and that will die with the phone. The past is curated because someone had time. The present is a mess because it is still happening. All of that is true. And it does not entirely dissolve the shape, and I will tell you why. Because of a note I was told about, which I did not see, and which I have decided to treat as a parable rather than a fact, which is, I think the honest way to handle anything you receive at third hand in a building full of stories. The note is said to have been written by an archivist in the middle of the last century, in a margin, in the ordinary way that people down there talk to themselves on paper. It reads, "We preserve eternity by excluding the present." Whether a man wrote that, or whether the building generated it the way damp generates a stain, it is an exact description of what the record does. And it points at something that I think is genuinely the darkest thing I have to give you tonight, darker than the ledgers. Because it is not about a decision at all. It is about identity. An institution that has staked everything on being outside of time cannot comfortably record itself being in time. To write down in detail the internal argument about whether to install electric light is to admit that electric light happened to you, that you were acted upon by a century, that you adapted, that you were shaped rather than only shaping. Every such record is a small piece of evidence that the Church is a thing in history rather than a thing above it. So the record thins, not by conspiracy, by instinct, the way a family album contains the weddings and not the arguments, not because anyone decided to hide the arguments, but because nobody thought to photograph them. And the not thinking is itself the shape of what the family believes about itself. And here is the trap, and it is a beautiful one, and it is the reason I am telling you this at the 9th hour of 10 rather than the 1st. It will not work. The gap will not read in 300 years as timelessness. It will read as flinching. A scholar in the 24th century, moving forward through the shelves, plague letters, Inquisition transcripts, village chronicles, the private despair of popes, all of it granular and pitiless and complete, will arrive at the 19th century and feel the resolution drop. And they will not conclude that the Church stood serenely outside the age of machines. They will conclude, correctly, that this was the point at which it stopped being able to look at itself in the same way. The omission will be the loudest entry in the whole collection. Because a silence surrounded by that much noise is not silence. It is a shape. And this is where I have to turn the lamp toward you for a moment, and I hope you will forgive me, because it is the reason this section exists at all. Everything I have described tonight is a mechanism, not a Vatican. The plastered door with the retired number, the keys with no locks, the apology written fair and left unsigned, the council prepared and never called, the formula that always, on every continent, in every decade, arrives at not at this time, the saint filed for tone, the absence that protects an identity. None of that requires Rome. It requires only an institution old enough to have something to protect and honest enough to keep the receipts. And it requires people who are not villains, that is the whole point, that is why I have laboured it. People with reasonable calendars and defensible caution and a strong sense that next year would be a better year to do the difficult thing. You have a drawer like this. I do. The conversation prepared and not had. The letter written out properly and left in the drafts folder, because the timing was wrong. And then it was still wrong. And then the person died. The thing you know about your family that everyone knows and nobody will say, which will pass to the next generation intact, in perfect condition, unopened. We all keep an archive. Ours is just badly catalogued, which is the only thing that lets us pretend we do not know what is in it. That is why the Vatican archive frightens people, I think. Not because it is alien. Because it is the same organ we all have, grown to the size of a city, and lit and indexed and available for inspection. There is one more thing I want to give you before we go down for the last time, and it is not dark at all, and I have been saving it. Between the plague letters, the ones from 1348, from monks drawing lots to decide who would carry bodies to the pit, there is a folder I have mentioned once and not opened. A town near Avignon. 30-odd children left at the cathedral steps, families gone, names unknown, and the bishop writing to Rome to ask what should be done with them. There is no recorded reply. Rome did not answer, but in the margin of that letter, in a smaller hand, from later, somebody added 5 words. They were taken in. 2 survived. That is all. Nobody signed it. It is not an official annotation, and it serves no administrative purpose whatsoever. Some clerk, at some later date, came into possession of a piece of information about the outcome of a question asked 700 years ago, and could not bear for the letter to sit in the file forever with no ending, and picked up a pen and completed it. 2 children out of 30. In the arithmetic of the Black Death that is a rounding error, and the man who wrote it knew that. He wrote it anyway. And I have come to think that is the actual answer to everything I have laid out tonight, not a resolution, but a counterweight against an institution that defers, a clerk who annotates. Against the formula that says no pronouncement at this time, 4 words in a smaller hand asking God's forgiveness. Against a system that stores a nurse's holiness behind a keypad, the townspeople who called her a saint before she was cold. The archive is not on one side of this. The archive holds both. It preserves the machinery of silence and the small human hands that keep reaching into the machinery and writing in the margins. We have one section left. The last vault. It is the smallest room in the building and the only one without a label, and what is in it is not documents. The last room is at the back, past everything, where the corridor narrows and then simply stops. It is about the size of a sacristy. There is no label on the door, not a blank plate this time, not a plastered-over ghost, just wood with nothing on it, which after everything else feels less like secrecy and more like exhaustion, as though whoever was naming the rooms got this far and ran out. Inside there are no shelves. There are boxes, stacked with the care of someone who expected them to be stacked for a long time, and the tags say things that are barely categories at all. Memoranda, fragments, writings without title. That last one is the true name of the room. Writings without title. Things that could not be filed anywhere else, because they are not about anything. They are only by somebody. A slip of paper with 6 words, "Forgive us for what we did not say." No date, no hand identified, no indication whether it refers to a council, a trial, a marriage, a child, or nothing at all. A sheet with the words "I believe," but, and then blank. Not trailing off, stopped. The pen was lifted and did not come back. A page of formal script, some administrative matter entirely ordinary, with a dove drawn in the corner in a child's hand. 2 curves for the body, a triangle for the beak. Somebody's son presumably got hold of his father's papers for 4 minutes in the year 16-something, and the drawing went into the file with the document, because separating them would have meant deciding which one was the record. A sheet of music with the notes scratched out, not crossed through, scratched, dug up with the nib until the paper thinned. None of these means anything on its own. That is the point of the room. It is where the archive puts the things it cannot make mean anything, and it keeps them at 58 degrees at the same expense as a papal bull, because in that building the alternative is unthinkable, and always has been. I lit that room perhaps a dozen times, and I never stayed long, and on the last occasion I stood in the doorway for a while, with the lamp down by my knee, and I finally understood what I had been walking through for 4 years. Let me put it as plainly as I can, and then I will let you go. We came down here tonight looking for the Vatican's darkest mysteries, and I have shown you honestly everything I know how to show you. A door with a retired number. 60 seals cut from orders that were withdrawn. A drawer of keys to locks nobody can find. A box of sweepings from a floor. A grey cabinet full of wonders that were answered with "not now." Apologies written out fair with a space where the signature should be. A pine box of councils that would have changed the world and were postponed for 100 years by men being modest. A shelf of beautiful ledgers whose only purpose is to record the moments when the institution looked at something terrible, wrote it down accurately, and resolved to say nothing. A steel cabinet of people who were holy at an inconvenient volume, and a hole in the record shaped like the last century and a half. And not one of those is a conspiracy. Not one of them required a wicked man. Every single one of them was produced by ordinary people making the ordinary decision to wait, because next year would be a better year, because the timing was wrong, because the world was not ready, because speaking would cost more than silence, because there were 12,000 more urgent things than this could keep. That is the darkest mystery of the Vatican archives, and it is not that the Church is worse than we thought. It is that deferral, applied at scale, over centuries, by decent people, produces exactly the same result as malice, and leaves nobody at all to blame. That is the finding. But it is not the whole finding, and I would be lying to you if I ended there, because there is a second thing sitting right beside it that I have been building toward all night. Every one of those failures reached us. Think about that for a moment before you drift. Every single item I have described tonight is known because the institution that failed kept the evidence of its own failure in good condition at its own expense for as long as it took. The seals were cut and the seals were kept. The apology was refused and the draft was kept. The council was cancelled and the agenda was kept. The silence was chosen and the silence was minuted with a date and a summary of the arguments against it, and filed on beautiful paper in a beautiful hand and shelved, so that 150 years later somebody could take it down and read it and say, "You knew." They had fire. For 2,000 years they had fire, and cheap fire, and unwatched centuries in which to use it. And what is down there is not ash. It is paper, humiliating, inconvenient, career-ending quantities of paper, indicting them in their own handwriting at 58 degrees. I do not think that was virtue most of the time. I think it was inertia and legal necessity, and the fact that the men who wrote hold were never the men who held the keys to the furnace. But I have come to believe there was something else in it too, running underneath, and I promised you at the start that I would tell you which of the three explanations I believe, and I will keep that promise now, while you are half under and better able to hear it. I think they kept everything because they knew they would be wrong again. Not wrong about a detail, wrong the way they had already been wrong before, completely, sincerely while singing, with the full apparatus of certainty behind them, in ways that would be obvious to a child in 300 years and were invisible to the best men alive at the time. An institution that has done that once can tell itself it was an aberration, an institution that has done it repeatedly, and has the files, cannot. And if you know that about yourself, that your certainty has a failure rate, and that you cannot see the failures from inside them, then the only rational act available to you is to leave the future the evidence it will need to convict you. That is what the archive is. It is not a vault of secrets. It is a confession made in advance to a court that has not been born yet, by an institution that does not trust its own judgment enough to destroy the record of it. Which brings me back to the room without a label, and the slip of paper that says, "Forgive us for what we did not say." That is the sentence the whole building has been trying to write. 53 miles of shelving, 12 centuries, all of it, and underneath the treaties and the trials and the plague letters and the paper boats, one unsigned scrap that got there first and said it in 6 words. Somebody wrote that. Somebody who could not name what they were sorry for, or could not bear to, wrote it anyway, and did not sign it, and put it into the one system on earth that they knew for certain would never throw it away. They were writing to you, not to their bishop, not to God, not to posterity in the grand sense, to whoever eventually stood in a small unlabelled room at the back with a lamp and had the patience to read a scrap with no title on it. And you have. Tonight, half asleep, in a bed or a chair or a parked car, somewhere I will never see. You did. So let me leave you with the thing I have carried up those 22 steps 1,000 times, and which I think is the only honest lesson the darkness down there has to teach. The Vatican is not unusual. It is only legible. Every institution defers, Every family defers. Every one of us has a drawer with a letter in it written out properly and never sent. A conversation prepared and postponed. A thing everybody knows that nobody will say. The difference is that the rest of us are not obliged to write down the moment we chose to wait, with a date on it, on paper that will last 400 years. Rome is, and that is why we can see it there and not in ourselves, and why it is so tempting to look at that building and feel superior, and why the feeling is a mistake. The question the archive asks, the only question it has ever asked, in every drawer, in every century, in Latin and Italian and bad country dialect, is this: when is a truth old enough to be harmless? And who decides? They never answered it. Neither has anyone else. But somewhere in this building, right now, there is something written out fair, in the good hand, on the good paper, finished, unsigned, waiting for a century that can afford it. And somewhere in your house, so is there. That is the whole of it. Turn out your lamp. The archive keeps its own hours and has never once needed us to stay awake for it. If tonight kept you company, if you drifted somewhere around the plague letters and woke up near the end, which is exactly how these are meant to work, then leave a comment and tell me where you were and what hour it was when you went under. I read them all, and there is something genuinely lovely about a map of strangers falling asleep in different time zones to the same set of drawers under Rome. And if you want more of these long, slow walks through the places history keeps locked, subscribe, but only if you truly do. I would rather have a small room of people who mean it. Sleep well. Somebody, centuries ago, kept a paper boat a child folded, and a note that said 2 of the 30 survived, and a scrap asking forgiveness for what was never said. They kept them for you. Good night, peace.